They said a man could buy anything at the Fort Mescalero auction: horses, cattle, even human souls. But when Ethan Calloway handed over his life savings for a defiant Apache woman named Aiyana, he didn't know he was purchasing his own redemption. By dawn, she would spit at his feet. By dusk, she would save his life. And by the time the smoke cleared from the valley, she would become the only thing he'd ever truly owned: his equal, his partner, his wife. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The sun hadn't yet burned the frost off the trading post steps when Ethan Calloway first laid eyes on her. Fort Mescalero squatted on the New Mexico territory like a wound that wouldn't heal: all raw timber and rotting canvas reeking of whiskey, gunpowder, and something far worse: human desperation. The auction block stood in the center of the compound, a platform of weathered pine stained dark by rain and God knows what else. Around it, men gathered like buzzards, their eyes hungry, their pockets heavy with coin earned from blood and land theft. Ethan stood apart from them, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn coat, his jaw tight beneath 3 days of stubble. At 34, he carried himself like a man who'd seen too much and said too little. The war had carved lines into his face that made him look older, deep grooves around his mouth, a permanent furrow between his brows and eyes the color of winter sky that rarely met anyone's gaze directly anymore. He hadn't come here to buy. He'd come because Doc Sullivan, the fort's half-drunk physician, had sent word that medical supplies were being auctioned off from a raid recovery. Ethan needed morphine and bandages for his ranch, where he tended to wounded animals and the occasional drifter who wandered onto his land with a bullet hole or a broken bone. But medical supplies weren't what the crowd had come for. "Gentlemen," the auctioneer's voice cracked across the morning air like a whip. He was a corpulent man named Virgil Sykes with a florid face and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "We've got prime merchandise today, fresh from the border raids. Strong backs, good teeth, some of them even speak English." Ethan's stomach turned. He should have left right then, should have walked away, collected his supplies from Doc Sullivan, and ridden back to his ranch where the only voices he had to hear were the wind through the cottonwoods and the occasional lowing of cattle. But then they brought her out. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, taller than most of the men in the crowd. Her hands were bound in front of her with rough hemp rope that had already rubbed her wrists raw, but she held her head high, her spine straight as a lodgepole pine. Her hair was black as a raven's wing, hanging loose past her shoulders despite the tangles and dust from the road. She wore a torn cotton dress, clearly not her own, probably forced on her to make her more presentable to white buyers. But beneath it, Ethan could see the proud bearing of someone who'd never been meant for chains. Her face was striking in a way that made men stare and then look away, unsettled by something they couldn't name. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that burned with such fierce intelligence and rage that they seemed to scorch the air itself. Those eyes swept across the crowd with open contempt, as if she were studying insects beneath her feet. When her gaze landed on Ethan, he felt it like a physical blow. She saw him, truly saw him, and something in her expression shifted, not softening, but calculating, measuring, as if she were deciding whether he was a threat or merely another coward complicit in this horror. He was the first to look away. "This here's a prime specimen." Sykes grabbed Aiyana's arm and yanked her forward. She didn't stumble, didn't flinch, just allowed herself to be moved, while her eyes promised murder. "Apache stock, healthy as a horse, probably 20 summers old. Look at them hands, she can work. Look at that face, she's easy on the eyes too, if you follow my meaning." Lewd laughter rippled through the crowd. Ethan felt bile rise in his throat. "She speak English," someone called out. "Enough to understand orders," Sykes said. "Ain't that right, darling?" Aiyana's response was to spit directly in his face. The crowd erupted, some laughing, others shouting in anger. Sykes backhanded her hard enough that her head snapped to the side, but she didn't make a sound. When she straightened, there was blood on her lip and absolute defiance in her eyes. Spirited. Sykes wiped his face with his sleeve, grinning despite the insult. Nothing a firm hand can't tame. We'll start the bidding at $50. 50, called a rancher Ethan recognized, Cal Henshaw, who ran a spread east of Silver Butte and was known for working his hired hands near to death. 60, another voice, this one belonging to a mine owner from the territorial capital. Ethan's hands curled into fists in his pockets. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. The war was supposed to have ended this, the buying and selling of human beings. But out here, in the territories where law was more suggestion than rule, old evils persisted like weeds in untended soil. 75. Henshaw again, his eyes traveling over Aiyana's body in a way that made Ethan's jaw clench. He should walk away. This wasn't his fight. He'd fought his war, lost his wife to cholera while he was gone, and come home to find his medical practice in Philadelphia scattered to the winds. He'd come west to disappear to tend to animals, instead of people, to never again have to choose between his conscience and his survival. But then Aiyana's eyes found his again, and in that moment something passed between them, not a plea, she was too proud for that, but a challenge. A question. Are you like them, or are you different? Ethan thought of Emily, his late wife, who'd sheltered runaway slaves in their basement in the years before the war. He thought of the patients he'd treated in secret, the ones who'd come to him with brands on their skin and horror stories of escape. He thought of the oath he'd taken first: do no harm. $100. The words left his mouth before his brain had fully approved them. The crowd turned to stare at him, the reclusive doctor who rarely came to town, who lived alone on his ranch and spoke to almost no one. Sykes's eyes lit up with greed. 100, do I hear 120, so 120. Henshaw wasn't backing down. Ethan's entire savings amounted to about $300 money he'd been setting aside to expand his barn, to buy better equipment, to maybe hire help for the spring branding. 150, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. Henshaw scowled, studying Ethan with narrowed eyes. What's a hermit doctor want with a slave woman? You even know what to do with a female doc? Or did that part of you die with your wife? The crowd snickered. Ethan didn't rise to the bait. He kept his eyes on Sykes, waiting. 150 going once, Sykes called out. 200, Henshaw spat. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. 200 was most of what he had. If he went higher, he'd have almost nothing left for supplies, for feed, for the mortgage payment due in 3 months. He looked at Aiyana again. She was watching him now with an expression he couldn't read. Her lip had stopped bleeding, but a bruise was already darkening on her cheekbone. Her bound hands were steady, no trembling, no fear, just waiting, enduring, the same way he'd seen soldiers wait before battle, knowing death was coming but refusing to bow to it. 250, Ethan heard himself say. The crowd went quiet. That was serious money. Henshaw's face purpled with rage, but he shook his head. He wasn't going higher. 250 going once, twice. Sykes was nearly salivating. Sold to the good doctor. It was done. Ethan felt numb as he walked to the auction block, pulling the roll of bills from his inner coat pocket. Money he'd saved over 2 years of setting bones, delivering calves, treating fevers, gone in an instant. Sykes counted the bills twice, then handed Ethan a rope, the one binding Aiyana's wrists. She's all yours, Doc. Got a bill of sale right here. I don't need it, Ethan said quietly. Suit yourself, but you'll want proof of ownership when the cavalry comes around asking questions. Ethan took the rope without responding. It felt like holding a snake. When he looked up at Aiyana, she was staring at him with an expression of such fierce, burning hatred that it nearly made him step back. Can you walk? He asked her softly. She said nothing. My horse is this way. He gestured toward the hitching post where his roan mare waited, and still Aiyana didn't move, didn't acknowledge his words. The crowd was dispersing, moving on to the next lot. A pair of teenage boys, half-starved and hollow-eyed. Ethan couldn't watch. He turned and started walking toward his horse, the rope slack in his hand. After a moment, he heard footsteps behind him. Aiyana was following, but only because the alternative was staying here. When they reached the mare, Ethan stopped. He pulled his hunting knife from his belt and saw Aiyana tense, saw her eyes track the blade. But instead of threatening her, he reached for her bound wrists. "Hold still," he said. She stood rigid as he cut through the rope, careful not to nick her already raw skin. The hemp fell away, and Aiyana immediately pulled her hands back, rubbing her wrists. Dark bruises circled them like ugly bracelets. "I have salve at home," Ethan said, "for the rope burns." She spat at his boots, a deliberate, contemptuous gesture. The spittle hit the dust-covered leather and slid down slowly. Then she spoke, for the first time her English clear, but flavored with an accent that turned certain consonants soft and made others sharp as broken glass. "You didn't buy me. You bought your shame." The words hit him like a slap, all the more powerful for their quiet delivery. She wasn't shouting, wasn't emotional. She was simply stating a fact as she saw it. Ethan looked down at his boots, at the spittle drying there in the morning sun. She was right. He'd tried to do the right thing, but the method was wrong. You couldn't free someone by purchasing them. Freedom couldn't be bought or sold. That was the entire problem. "Maybe I did," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "But that shame is mine to carry, not yours. You can leave whenever you want." "Leave," she laughed, a sound like breaking glass, "to where your people have bounties on Apache heads. They pay more for women because we breed. They pay even more for children because they're easier to train." She loaded that last word with venom. "You think I can just walk into the sunset? I would be captured again before nightfall, sold again, beaten again, raped again." Each word was a hammer blow. Ethan absorbed them, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then stay," he said, "not as property, as a guest, until it's safe." Safe. Her eyes blazed. "It will never be safe. Not for me, not for any of us. Your people made sure of that when they decided we were less than human." "They're not my people," Ethan said quietly. "I don't claim them. You don't have to. You share their skin. You reap their benefits. You live on stolen land in a house built by stolen labor from crops grown in stolen soil." She stepped closer, and Ethan forced himself not to retreat. "You want to absolve yourself. You want to buy your way out of guilt. It doesn't work like that." "I know," Ethan said, "but I couldn't stand there and watch you be sold to Henshaw. I couldn't—" He stopped, struggled for words. "I couldn't live with myself. So instead I have to live with you." Aiyana's smile was bitter. How generous. They stood there in the morning sun, two strangers bound by the worst kind of transaction, neither knowing what came next. Finally, Ethan sighed. "I have a ranch. Half a day's ride west. There's food, clean water, a spare room. You're welcome to it for as long as you need." "Welcome," she repeated, tasting the word like poison. "Am I welcome or am I owned?" "You're free," Ethan said. "I'm not your master. I never will be." "Then what are you—" It was a question he didn't have an answer for, so he simply said, "A man trying to do less harm than he's already done." Aiyana studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for deception, for hidden cruelty, for the trap she was sure was there. When she didn't find it, or when she simply decided survival meant playing along, she gave a single curt nod. "I will come," she said. "But if you touch me, if you attempt to claim any of the rights those men think they purchased, I will kill you in your sleep. I may die for it, but you will die first. This I promise." "Understood," Ethan said, and he meant it. He helped her onto the mare she mounted with practiced ease, clearly familiar with horses, then swung up behind her. It was improper, certainly by white society standards, but propriety was the least of his concerns. He kept his hands on the reins, careful not to touch her more than necessary, and turned the mare west toward home. As Fort Mescalero disappeared behind them, neither spoke. The only sounds were the horses' hooves on the packed earth, the creak of saddle leather, and the wind that swept across the high desert plateau, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. But in the crowd they left behind, standing in the shadow of the trading post, a group of men watched them go. One of them was Henshaw, his face still purple with rage. Next to him stood Sykes, counting his money, and behind them both lurked the two brothers who ran the raiding parties that captured slaves in the first place, the Gaines brothers, Caleb and Josiah, men with dead eyes and quick knives. "Doc's gonna regret that purchase," Henshaw muttered. Sykes grinned. "Give him a few days with that hellcat. He'll be bringing her back begging us to take her off his hands." But Caleb Gaines shook his head slowly, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "That one's worth more than $250, way more. She's the daughter of Cochet, one of the Apache war chiefs. We should have mentioned that to drive up the price." Josiah Gaines spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "So, what do we do?" Caleb smiled, and it was the kind of smile that meant someone was going to die. "We wait. Let the doc think he's safe. Then we go collect our property." "She ain't his property," Henshaw said. "He bought her fair and square." "Fair," Caleb laughed. "There ain't nothing fair about it. We took her, we decide what happens to her. That piece of paper Sykes has, that bill of sale, it don't mean a damn thing if the seller's lying about the goods. And we never said nothing about her being a chief's daughter. That makes her stolen goods, not legal property. We can take her back any time we want." Sykes's grin faded. "Now wait just a—" "You'll get your cut," Caleb cut him off. "But that Apache princess is worth 10 times what the doc paid. There's collectors in Santa Fe, even down in Mexico City, who'll pay top dollar for a chief's daughter, especially one that looks like that." The men looked west, where the dust from Ethan's horse still hung in the air like a fading ghost. "How long we wait?" Josiah asked. "A week," Caleb said. "Let the doc get comfortable. Let him think he saved her. Then we remind him who really runs things out here." They laughed the sound ugly and cold and went back into the trading post for whiskey and cards, already planning their next move. But they didn't know Ethan Calloway. They didn't know about the field hospitals during the war where he'd operated by candlelight while artillery thundered overhead. They didn't know about the times he'd held dying men in his arms and promised them their deaths meant something even when he knew it was a lie. They didn't know about the night he came home to find Emily's grave, already dug her body, already cold, and the life he'd planned already ashes. Most of all, they didn't know what a man was capable of when he had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The ride to the ranch took 6 hours. The terrain shifted from flat desert to rolling hills, from barren rock to grassland dotted with juniper and pine. Storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, promising rain before nightfall. Ethan felt Aiyana's tension in the set of her shoulders, in the way she held herself rigid to avoid touching him any more than necessary. He couldn't blame her. For all she knew, he was taking her somewhere isolated to do the terrible things men did to powerless women. "There's a canteen on the saddle horn," he said after 2 hours of silence. "If you're thirsty." She didn't respond, didn't move. Another hour passed. "The ranch is called Silver Butte," he tried again. "Used to be a cattle outfit, but I mostly keep horses now. A few head of cattle for milk and meat. Some chickens. It's quiet." Still nothing. Ethan gave up trying to make conversation. If silence was what she needed, he could give her that. As they climbed into the foothills, the landscape transformed. Ponderosa pines rose up around them, their bark orange-red in the afternoon light. A creek ran parallel to the trail, its water clear and cold from mountain snowmelt. This was the country Ethan had fallen in love with when he first came west, wild and clean, untouched by the ugliness of civilization. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, the ranch came into view. It wasn't much. A single-story house built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney, a barn that had seen better days but still stood square, a corral with half a dozen horses, and beyond that, open pasture stretching toward the tree line. Smoke rose from the chimney. Ethan had left a fire banked before he left that morning. He dismounted first, then offered Aiyana his hand. She ignored it and slid down on her own landing lightly, despite the long ride. "This is it," Ethan said, gesturing at the house. "It's not much, but it's sturdy. Keeps the rain out mostly." Aiyana said nothing. Her eyes swept over the property, calculating, assessing, looking for threats, for escape routes, for weapons. "The spare room is inside," Ethan continued. "It's got a bed, a chest for belongings, a window that opens. The door has a lock. On the inside," he added, making sure she understood. "You can lock it from your side. I don't have a key." That got her attention. She looked at him sharply, searching for the lie. "Why?" she asked. "Because you're not a prisoner," Ethan said simply. "You're a guest, and guests get privacy. Guests can leave. So can you. I already told you that." Aiyana's jaw worked as if she were chewing on words too bitter to speak. Finally, she said, "Show me this room." Ethan led her inside. The house was sparse, a main room with a fireplace table and chairs, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, 2 bedrooms, and a small washroom. Everything was clean, but worn, the home of a man who lived simply because he'd forgotten how to want more. The spare room was at the back of the house. It had indeed been Emily's sewing room once, but Ethan had converted it after she died. A narrow bed with a quilt. Emily had made a chest of drawers, a small table with a basin and pitcher. The window looked out over the pasture toward the mountains. Aiyana entered slowly, her eyes taking in every detail. She walked to the window and tested it. It opened smoothly. A way out, if needed. Then she turned to the door and found the lock Ethan had mentioned, a simple latch that could only be worked from inside the room. "You really can't open this?" she asked, suspicion heavy in her voice. "Not without breaking down the door," Ethan confirmed. "And you'd hear me coming long before I managed that." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a single nod. Not trust, but acknowledgement that he'd spoken truth. "I'll leave you to rest," Ethan said. "There's water in the pitcher. I'll make supper in about an hour. You're welcome to join me, or I can bring you a plate." "I don't eat food from men who buy women," Aiyana said flatly. Ethan absorbed that blow without flinching. "Suit yourself, but the offer stands." He left, closing the door behind him. A moment later, he heard the latch slide home, the sound of a cage door closing, even though he was the one outside it. In the kitchen, Ethan stood for a long moment, his hands braced on the table, his head bowed. What had he done? What had he been thinking? That he could buy someone's freedom? That a man who'd spent 3 years cutting bullets out of boys' bodies and amputating limbs could somehow heal the wounds of slavery with a handful of bills? "Fool," he muttered to himself, but done was done. Aiyana was here under his roof, and he'd made her a promise she was free. Now he had to figure out how to keep that promise in a world that didn't believe women like her deserved freedom in the first place. He started supper: beans and salt pork biscuits from dough he'd prepared that morning, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Simple food, but filling. As he worked, his mind circled back to the auction, to the look in Henshaw's eyes, to the way Sykes had counted that money. They wouldn't let this go. Men like that never did. Ethan had embarrassed Henshaw, and worse, he'd taken something other men had wanted. Out here, that was enough to get you killed. He'd have to be careful. Keep his rifle close, his eyes open. Maybe send word to the sheriff in Silver Butte, though that was probably useless. The law out here bent whichever way money pushed it. When supper was ready, Ethan knocked softly on Aiyana's door. "Food's on the table. I'll leave a plate for you." No response. He ate alone, the silence of the house pressing in around him. He was used to silence, had courted it even after Emily died, but this was different. This was a silence full of tension, of unspoken accusations, of a woman on the other side of a door wondering if this night would be the one where her worst fears came true. After he finished eating, Ethan cleaned up, then took a plate of food and set it outside Aiyana's door, along with a cup of water. He knocked once and said, "It's here when you want it." Then he retreated to his own room and tried to sleep, though rest was a long time coming. In her room, Aiyana listened to his footsteps fade away. She waited until she heard his door close, then waited another hour beyond that, counting her heartbeats, listening for any sound of movement, when she was certain he was asleep, or at least in his room. She crept to her door and eased it open. The plate of food sat there, still warm. Her stomach clenched with hunger. She hadn't eaten since the day before, and that had been only a handful of cornmeal and water. She stared at the plate for a long time, pride warring with survival. Pride was a luxury, and she'd learned long ago that luxury got you killed. She took the plate back into her room, locked the door again, and ate in darkness, each bite tasting like defeat. But as she swallowed the last of the beans, she thought about the lock on the door, about the window that opened, about the way this strange white man had cut her bonds and told her she was free. She didn't believe him, couldn't afford to, but maybe, just maybe, she could use his guilt, use his need to play the savior, use whatever strange code of honor had made him spend his life's savings on a woman he didn't know. She would stay. Not because she trusted him, but because survival meant keeping your enemies close until you understood their weaknesses. And when she did understand them, when she knew exactly how to strike, well, she'd make that decision when the time came. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Rain hammered the roof and thunder rolled across the valley like distant drums. In his room, Ethan lay awake listening to the storm and wondering what morning would bring. In her room, Aiyana stood at the window watching lightning flash across the mountains and made herself a promise she would survive this as she had survived everything else. And no man, no matter how gentle his voice or how guilty his conscience, would ever own her again. The rain continued through the night and into the next morning, turning the world beyond the windows into a gray wash of water and mist. Ethan woke before dawn as he always did, his body still running on the rhythms of war despite 10 years of peace. He lay in bed for a moment listening to the drumming on the roof before remembering he wasn't alone anymore. He dressed quietly and padded to the kitchen in his stockinged feet. The plate he'd left outside Aiyana's door was gone. At least she'd eaten. That was something. He built up the fire in the stove and set coffee to boil, then checked the rain barrels outside. They were overflowing, which meant he wouldn't need to haul water from the creek for a few days. Small mercies. As he came back inside, shaking water from his hair, he noticed Aiyana's door was still closed, the latch still drawn. He wondered if she'd slept at all. By the time full light came, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle. Ethan pulled on his oilskin coat and boots and headed to the barn to check on the horses. The structure was old but solid, built by whoever had owned this land before him. Inside, 6 horses occupied the stalls, their breath steaming in the damp air. His mare, the roan he'd ridden yesterday, nickered when she saw him. "Morning, Ruby," he murmured, running a hand down her neck. "Sorry about the long ride yesterday. I'll give you a few days off." He worked methodically, feeding and watering each horse, checking their hooves, looking for signs of injury or illness. This was the work he preferred now, the kind where his patients couldn't talk back, couldn't accuse him of failing them. Animals were simpler. They hurt you, healed them. They died, and it was nature, not negligence. He was mucking out the last stall when he heard the barn door creak. He turned to find Aiyana standing in the entrance, her silhouette backlit by the gray morning light. She'd changed out of the torn cotton dress into something she must have found in the chest. In her room, one of Emily's old work dresses, simple blue calico, that hung loose on her taller frame. Her hair was pulled back from her face, revealing the bruise on her cheekbone that had darkened overnight to a deep purple black. They stared at each other across the dusty barn, neither speaking. Finally, Ethan set down the pitchfork and wiped his hands on his pants. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's on the stove if you want some." "I don't drink coffee," Aiyana replied. Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't used it in a long time. "There's water then, or I can make tea if—" "Why did you buy me?" The question cut through his fumbling hospitality like a knife. Ethan stood there caught in her direct gaze and realized there was no good answer, at least none that wouldn't sound like self-serving justification. "I couldn't watch you be sold to Henshaw," he said finally. "I've seen men like him. I know what he would have done to you. So you did it instead?" "No." The word came out harder than he'd intended. "I told you yesterday, you're free to go whenever you want. I won't stop you. And I told you yesterday, there's nowhere to go." Aiyana stepped further into the barn, her eyes never leaving his. "You want to know what freedom is for someone like me, Doctor? It's the space between one cage and the next. It's the moment before the trap closes, that's all. There is no true freedom, not anymore. Your people made sure of that." Ethan absorbed the words, feeling their weight. "So what do you want from me?" "Want?" She laughed, that same bitter sound from yesterday. "I want my tribe back. I want my mother who died screaming when your soldiers burned our village. I want my father who was shot in the back while trying to protect us. I want my brother who was 8 years old when they took him and I never saw him again. Can you give me any of that, Doctor?" "No," Ethan said quietly. "I can't." "Then what good are you?" It was a fair question. Ethan turned back to his work, driving the pitchfork into the soiled hay with more force than necessary. "No good at all, probably, but this is what I've got: a roof that doesn't leak much, food enough for 2, and land where nobody bothers us. If that's worth something to you, you can stay. If it's not, then go." He heard her move closer, her footsteps soft in the straw. When he looked up, she was standing just a few feet away, studying him with those dark, penetrating eyes. "You were a soldier," she said. "It wasn't a question. Medic, Union Army. You killed people. I tried to save them, but some died anyway." Ethan's hands tightened on the pitchfork handle. "Yes, a lot of them died. Does that haunt you?" He met her gaze without flinching. "Every single day." Something flickered in her expression, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement of one scarred soul seeing another. "My people have a saying," Aiyana said slowly. "The warrior who never questions his kills is already dead inside. The warrior who questions too much dies on the outside." She paused. "You question? Is that a weakness?" "It's human." She turned away, running her hand along Ruby's neck. The horse snorted but didn't shy away. "This one knows me already. Animals are better judges of character than people." Ethan couldn't argue with that. He watched as Aiyana continued to stroke Ruby, her movements confident and gentle. "You know horses. My father had many. He taught me to ride before I could walk properly." Her voice had gone distant, lost in memory. "He said a warrior without a horse is like a bird without wings, alive but not truly living." Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was." Aiyana's jaw tightened. "Until your people decided wisdom didn't matter if you had the wrong color skin." Ethan wanted to say something, anything that might ease the rawness of that pain, but he knew better. Some wounds had no salve except time, and even then, they never truly healed. They just became part of the landscape of who you were. They worked in silence after that, Aiyana helping him finish the morning chores without being asked. She moved through the barn with practiced efficiency, clearly familiar with this kind of work. When they were done, they walked back to the house through the drizzle, both soaked despite their coats. Inside, Ethan hung his oilskin by the door and started pulling together ingredients for breakfast. "I'm making flapjacks. You're welcome to—" "I'll cook," Aiyana interrupted. "You'll burn them." Ethan blinked. "I won't burn them. Men always burn them. They make the pan too hot because they're impatient." She moved past him to the stove, examining the skillets hanging on the wall. "Where's your flour?" He showed her, bemused, and then found himself relegated to the table while she took over his kitchen. She cooked with the same quiet competence she'd shown in the barn, mixing batter, heating the skillet to precisely the right temperature, flipping the flapjacks at exactly the right moment. Soon the smell of cooking filled the house, warm and domestic, and so achingly normal that Ethan felt something crack in his chest. When had he last shared breakfast with someone? When had this house last felt like a home, instead of just a place where he slept between long days of work? Aiyana set a plate in front of him without ceremony, 3 perfect flapjacks, golden brown and steaming. She took her own plate and sat across from him at the table, the first time they'd shared a meal face to face. They ate in silence. The flapjacks were excellent. Ethan tried not to let his surprise show, but Aiyana caught it anyway. "What?" she asked, an edge of challenge in her voice. "Nothing. They're good, really good." "You sound surprised." I didn't expect you to cook for me." "I'm not cooking for you," Aiyana said flatly. "I'm cooking for myself. You just happen to be here." "Fair enough." They finished eating and Ethan washed the dishes while Aiyana stood at the window watching the rain. The silence between them had shifted somehow, becoming less hostile and more watchful, like 2 animals in adjacent territories acknowledging each other's existence without declaring war. The rest of the day passed in that same uneasy coexistence. The rain kept them mostly indoors, and Ethan found himself hyper-aware of Aiyana's presence in his house. She moved quietly, exploring with the careful attention of someone mapping potential escape routes. He saw her testing the windows, studying the locks, examining the knives in the kitchen, with the eye of someone who knew exactly how to use them. Late in the afternoon, the rain finally stopped. Ethan went outside to check for storm damage and found a section of fence down near the east pasture. He'd need to repair it before the horses wandered off. He was gathering tools from the barn when Aiyana appeared beside him. "I'll help," she said. "You don't have to." "I know, I'm doing it anyway." They walked to the damaged fence together, Ethan carrying the toolbox and replacement rails, Aiyana studying the land around them with keen interest. When they reached the break, Ethan set down his burden and began examining the damage. 2 rails were cracked, victims of a fallen branch during the storm. "Hold this steady," he said, positioning a new rail. Aiyana moved without hesitation, gripping the wood while he nailed it in place. They worked together smoothly, and Ethan found himself grateful for the help. Emily used to help him like this back before the war, back when they'd dreamed of building something lasting together. "You loved her very much," Aiyana said suddenly. Ethan nearly dropped the hammer. "What? Your wife, the one who owned that dress I'm wearing. You still think about her?" He shouldn't have been surprised. Grief had a way of broadcasting itself, no matter how well you tried to hide it. "Yes, I loved her." "How did she die?" "Cholera. While I was at war." He drove a nail with more force than necessary. "I came home to an empty house and a grave I didn't even get to dig." "Did you blame yourself?" The question was too perceptive. Ethan's hands stilled on the hammer. "Every day. Because you weren't there to save her. Because I chose to go, chose to leave her alone." He looked up, meeting Aiyana's eyes. "She begged me not to enlist, said we could go west, leave the war behind. But I told her I had a duty, that I could save lives." His laugh was bitter. "Saved hundreds of soldiers, lost the one person who mattered most." Aiyana was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My mother told me once that we cannot choose what the gods take from us. We can only choose how we carry the loss." Wise woman. She was, until the cavalry came and shot her for trying to protect her children. Aiyana's voice was matter-of-fact, but Ethan heard the ocean of pain beneath it. "I was hiding in a root cellar with my little brother. We heard her screaming. I had to hold my hand over his mouth to keep him quiet, to keep us both alive. I felt him crying against my palm, felt his terror, and I just held on while my mother died above us." Ethan's throat tightened. That brother, they found him 2 days later when we tried to run. Took him, I tried to fight, but there were too many. She touched her wrist absently where faint scars showed beneath the rope burns. They tied me up and laughed while I screamed his name, said they were taking him somewhere to civilize him, make him white inside. Jesus, Ethan breathed. Your God was not there that day, or any day since. Aiyana turned back to the fence, gripping the next rail with white-knuckled hands. So yes, Doctor, we both know about loss. We both know about guilt. The difference is your people are the ones who caused mine. She was right, of course. There was no arguing with that truth. Ethan finished nailing the rail in place, his movements mechanical, his mind churning with thoughts that had nowhere to go. When the fence was repaired, they walked back to the house as the sun broke through the clouds, painting the wet landscape in shades of gold and green. That evening, Aiyana cooked again, a simple stew made from salt pork potatoes and wild onions she'd found growing near the creek. As they ate, Ethan found himself studying her when he thought she wasn't looking. She had the kind of beauty that wasn't meant to be soft or pretty. It was fierce like the landscape itself, all sharp edges and dramatic angles, beautiful precisely because it refused to compromise. Stop staring, she said without looking up from her bowl. Sorry. No, you're not. But there was no heat in the words. After dinner, Ethan retreated to his room with a medical text trying to focus on anatomy diagrams, while his mind kept drifting to the woman on the other side of his wall. He heard her moving around, heard water splashing as she washed, heard the creak of her bed as she settled in for the night. He wondered what she was thinking, if she was planning to run, if she was lying awake wondering when he'd try to force himself on her despite his promises. The thought made him sick. 3 days passed in that same pattern. They cooked together, worked together, existed in parallel orbits around each other. Aiyana never smiled, never laughed, never let her guard down for a moment, but she also stopped looking at him with quite so much raw hatred. It was progress of a sort. On the 4th morning, Ethan was treating a lame horse when Aiyana came to the barn carrying a basket. I need to gather herbs, she said, for medicine. What kind of herbs? The kind that grow in the forest. At his hesitation, she added, I'm not running away, if that's what you're worried about. I need yarrow sage and willow bark for infections and fever. You'll need them eventually if you're going to keep playing doctor out here. She was right. His medical supplies were dangerously low. The forest is about a mile north, he said, past the creek. I know, I've been watching. At his surprised look, she almost smiled. I'm Apache. I notice things. Take Ruby, Ethan said. She's the gentlest. I don't need gentle. I need fast. Aiyana moved to the stall where a young black stallion stood. This one, what's his name? Smoke, but he's green broke, still wild around the edges. Good. So am I. Before Ethan could protest, she had the horse out of the stall and was swinging onto his bare back with a grace that took his breath away. Smoke danced and snorted, but Aiyana's hands were firm, her seat perfect. She looked down at Ethan from her perch, and for the first time since he'd met her, something like satisfaction crossed her face. Don't worry, Doctor. I'll bring your horse back. Then she was gone, urging Smoke into a canter that carried them across the pasture and into the trees beyond. Ethan stood in the barn doorway, watching her disappear. She could keep going, he realized. Could ride that horse all the way to the next territory. He'd never catch her. But she'd said she'd come back. He found himself hoping she'd meant it. The morning stretched on. Ethan threw himself into work, repairing a broken harness, cleaning his medical instruments, doing anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on the fact that Aiyana might be gone for good. Noon came and went. His stomach knotted with worry he had no right to feel. What was she to him? A woman he'd bought no matter that his intentions had been good, the fact remained. A stranger who hated everything he represented. Someone who'd made it clear she could barely stand his presence. And yet, he found himself checking the tree line every few minutes, listening for hoofbeats, worrying about bandits or wild animals or any of 100 things that could hurt someone alone in the wilderness. It was past 2 in the afternoon when he finally heard Smoke's whinny. Ethan was out the door in seconds, his heart hammering with a relief he couldn't name. Aiyana rode into the yard, the basket tied to her saddle bulging with green plants. Her face was flushed from the ride, her hair wind-tangled, and if he didn't know better, he'd have said she looked almost happy. "You came back," he said, before he could stop himself. She dismounted, giving him a long look. "I said I would. You also said you'd kill me in my sleep if I touched you. Forgive me for thinking you might not keep all your promises." Something flickered in her eyes, amusement maybe, or surprise that he'd throw her own words back at her. "That promise I'll keep too, if you give me reason." Noted. Ethan took Smoke's reins and led him to the barn while Aiyana carried her basket to the house. By the time he'd settled the horse, she had plants spread across the kitchen table, sorting them with practiced efficiency. "This is yarrow," she said, holding up a flowering stem. "You make a poultice for wounds. It stops bleeding, prevents infection." She set it aside and picked up another plant. "This is sage. Boil it for fever, burn it for cleansing spirits. And this," she held up strips of bark, "is willow. Chew it for pain, brew it for headache." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. Her hands moved with confidence, stripping leaves, separating stems. This was knowledge passed down through generations, refined by centuries of survival in harsh land. "Will you teach me?" Aiyana paused, looking up at him. "Why would I do that?" "Because I'm a doctor and I don't know half of what you do about healing." He pushed off the doorframe and came closer. "Because knowledge shouldn't die with those who hold it. Because," he hesitated, then finished honestly, "because I want to learn." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity against the 1,000 reasons not to trust him. Finally, she nodded once. "Sit, pay attention. I won't repeat myself." Ethan sat across from her, and for the next 2 hours, Aiyana taught him the medicine of her people. She showed him which plants could draw poison from snakebite, which could reduce fever, which could ease a woman's monthly pain, or help a mother's milk come in after childbirth. She explained dosages and preparations, described symptoms and treatments, shared knowledge that had kept her people alive for centuries before white men came with their hospitals and their arrogance. Ethan listened, truly listened, asking questions only when he needed clarification. He recognized some of what she described, the active properties in willow bark, were similar to salicylic acid. The yarrow contained compounds that promoted clotting, but understanding the science behind it didn't diminish the medicine. If anything, it made him respect her knowledge more. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, something shifted between them. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. Two healers recognizing each other across a chasm of pain and history. When Aiyana finally finished, she gathered her sorted plants and stood. "I'll dry these and make preparations. You'll keep them with your other supplies." "Thank you," Ethan said. She paused at the doorway to her room. "Don't thank me, doctor. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because good medicine shouldn't be wasted, no matter who's here to use it." She disappeared into her room, but for once, she didn't immediately lock the door. Ethan sat at the table, his mind full of new information, his chest full of something he couldn't name. Hope, maybe, or just the absence of hopelessness, which was nearly the same thing. Outside, the sun sank toward the mountains, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its evening song. Inside the small ranch house, two people who'd been strangers just days ago moved around each other like planets finding their orbits. Pulled by gravity, held apart by momentum, slowly learning the mathematics of coexistence. And in the town of Silver Butte, Caleb Gaines cleaned his rifle and counted the days until he'd make his move. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt almost normal, though Ethan knew better than to mistake routine for peace. Each morning he woke to find Aiyana already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the quiet efficiency that had become her trademark. Each evening they worked side by side in comfortable silence, tending animals, repairing fences, storing food for winter, and each night that door between them remained closed but no longer felt quite so much like a barrier between enemies. It was on the 8th day that everything changed. Ethan had ridden into Silver Butte for supplies, leaving Aiyana at the ranch despite her protests. "You shouldn't go alone," she'd said, standing in the barn doorway with her arms crossed. "Those men at the auction, they'll remember you." "They'll remember me either way," Ethan replied, cinching Ruby's saddle. "But if I bring you to town, they'll remember both of us. That's worse. Or maybe they need to see that I'm not afraid of them." Ethan had looked at her, then really looked at her, and saw the warrior beneath the bruises that had finally started to fade. "I know you're not afraid, but courage doesn't stop bullets, and I'd rather not test whether they're willing to shoot in broad daylight." She'd relented, but he could feel her eyes on his back the entire ride down the valley, watching until he disappeared around the bend in the trail. Silver Butte was larger than Fort Mescalero, but not by much, a collection of wooden buildings huddled around a main street like cattle bunching against a storm. The general store, the saloon, the blacksmith, the assayer's office. Everything a mining town needed to separate desperate men from their gold. Ethan tied Ruby outside the general store and went inside, nodding to Mrs. Chen, the proprietor. She was one of the few people in town who didn't treat him like a ghost or a curiosity. Her husband had been a railroad worker until a dynamite accident took his legs, and Ethan had spent 3 days keeping the man alive while gangrene tried to claim him. Mr. Chen still couldn't walk, but he was alive, and his wife never forgot who'd made that possible. "Dr. Calloway," she greeted him with a slight bow. "The usual supplies." "Yes, ma'am, and more flour if you have it. I'm going through it faster than expected." Mrs. Chen's eyes flickered with something, curiosity maybe, or knowing. Small towns had no secrets, and Ethan's purchase at the auction had undoubtedly made the rounds. But she said nothing, simply began pulling items from the shelves and tallying them in her careful script. Ethan was examining a bolt of cloth, thinking maybe Aiyana would like a dress that actually fit her, when the door banged open and Cal Henshaw walked in. The rancher's eyes found Ethan immediately, and his mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile if smiles could carry that much malice. "Well, well, the good doctor. Been wondering when you'd show your face in town." Henshaw sauntered closer, his boots loud on the wooden floor. "How's that purchase of yours working out?" She as wild in bed as she looked on that auction block. Every muscle in Ethan's body tensed, but he kept his voice level. "That's not a conversation I'm having with you, Henshaw." "Why not? You paid good money for her. Seems like a man ought to be able to discuss his property." Henshaw leaned against the counter, his grin widening. "Unless maybe you're not man enough to handle her. That it, Doc, she too much woman for a broke-down medic." Mrs. Chen cleared her throat. "Mr. Henshaw, if you're not here to buy anything—" "Shut your mouth, Chinaman." Henshaw didn't even look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on Ethan, cold and predatory. "I'm talking to the doctor here, having a friendly conversation about his new wife. Or is she your wife? You marry that savage properly, or you just keeping her as livestock?" Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides. He'd fought in the war, seen men die over insults smaller than this, and he knew exactly how this would go if he let his temper slip. Henshaw was baiting him, looking for an excuse to start something that would end with blood on the floor. "She's a guest in my home," Ethan said quietly, each word measured and deliberate. "Not livestock, not property. A person under my protection, and I'd appreciate it if you'd refer to her with respect or not at all." Henshaw laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Protection, that's rich. You know what I think, Doc. I think you're playing house with a squaw and pretending it's something noble. I think you're just as much a savage lover as those abolitionists who got us into that damn war, and I think—" "That's enough." The new voice came from the doorway, cold and authoritative. Ethan turned to see Sheriff Tom Bridger standing there, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. Bridger was a weathered man in his 50s with gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He'd served in the same regiment as Ethan during the war, though they'd rarely crossed paths. Henshaw straightened his expression, souring. "Sheriff, didn't realize you were protecting bought women now." "I'm protecting the peace," Bridger said evenly, "which means I don't tolerate men starting fights in Mrs. Chen's store. You got business here, Henshaw, or are you just running your mouth?" For a moment, it looked like Henshaw might push back, but even he wasn't foolish enough to challenge the sheriff directly. No business, just leaving. He shouldered past Bridger, pausing to look back at Ethan. "Enjoy your purchase while it lasts, Doc. Things have a way of going missing out in the territories. Animals, property, people. Real shame when that happens." The threat hung in the air long after Henshaw was gone. Ethan released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his hands still shaking slightly with suppressed adrenaline. "You all right, Doc?" Bridger asked, moving into the store properly. "Fine, thank you for the intervention." "Wasn't for you." Bridger glanced at Mrs. Chen, who'd gone pale. "Mrs. Chen doesn't need trouble in her establishment. Bad for business." He paused, studying Ethan with those keen eyes. "But since we're talking, maybe we should have a conversation about that woman you're keeping at your ranch." Ethan's jaw tightened. "She's not—" "I know what she's not," Bridger interrupted. "I also know what she is. Aiyana, daughter of Kochai. There's paper on her family going back 3 years. Rewards for information leading to their capture. Most of them are dead now, but she's still listed as an escaped hostile." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. "She's not hostile. She was taken captive, sold like chattel. I know." Bridger's expression was unreadable. "And I also know that, legally speaking, that sale might not have been legitimate. The Gaines brothers have a habit of claiming they're selling willing workers, when what they're really doing is trafficking in kidnapped people. If someone wanted to make trouble, they could argue, you're harboring stolen property. She's a human being, not property. You and I might agree on that, Doc, but the law out here is murkier than you'd like." Bridger moved closer, lowering his voice. "I'm telling you this as someone who owes you his life. Those wounds you patched at Antietam, I'd have died from them if you hadn't worked through the night. So I'm paying that debt now with a warning. The Gaines brothers are asking questions about you, about her. They're not happy about losing out on what they consider a valuable asset." Ethan felt ice slide down his spine. "What do they want? To get her back? To make an example of you? Maybe both." Bridger glanced toward the door, as if checking they weren't being overheard. "They're planning something, though I don't know what yet. My advice, be ready, keep your weapons close and your eyes open, and maybe consider that your ranch is a long way from help if trouble comes calling." "Are you telling me the law won't protect us?" Bridger's smile was sad. "I'm telling you the law out here only reaches as far as a man can ride in a day. And by the time I could get to your place, whatever's going to happen will already be done. I'll do what I can, Doc, but you need to be prepared to protect yourself." After Bridger left, Ethan finished his purchases in a daze, Mrs. Chen's worried eyes following him as he loaded supplies into Ruby's saddlebags. The ride back to the ranch felt twice as long, every shadow seeming to hide a threat, every sound making his hand drift toward the rifle inside his saddle scabbard. When he finally rode into the yard, Aiyana was waiting on the porch, her arms crossed, her expression dark. "You were gone too long. I was about to come looking for you. Had some trouble in town." Ethan dismounted, began unloading supplies, ran into Henshaw and the sheriff. Aiyana went very still. "What did the lawman say?" "That we should be careful, that the Gaines brothers are planning something." He looked at her, seeing the way her face had closed off, become a mask. "He told me who you are, Kochai's daughter. And now you're afraid." It wasn't a question. "No, now I understand why they want you back so badly." Ethan carried a sack of flour into the house, Aiyana following. Your father was a war chief. That makes you valuable as a hostage, a bargaining chip, or worse." "My father is dead," Aiyana said flatly. "There's nothing left to bargain for." "But they don't know that, or maybe they don't care. Maybe you're valuable just for who you are." He set down the flower and turned to face her. "Aiyana, I need you to understand something. If they come here, if the Gaines brothers or Henshaw or anyone else tries to take you, I won't let them. But I also need to know, are there other members of your tribe who might come looking for you?" She laughed, a sound full of broken glass and old pain. "My tribe is scattered. The ones who survived the massacres are in hiding or on reservations dying slowly of your people's kindness. No one is coming to save me, Doctor. There is no cavalry riding over the hill, no warriors appearing in the night. I am alone. That's what being Apache means, now being alone in a land that was once ours." Ethan wanted to say something comforting, something that might ease the desolation in her words, but there was nothing. No words could undo what had been done, no promises could restore what had been taken. Instead, he said, "You're not alone. Not anymore." Aiyana stared at him, her eyes searching his face for the lie, for the trap, for whatever self-serving motivation he must have for saying such things. When she didn't find it, something in her expression cracked just slightly, like ice beginning to thaw. "Why?" she asked, and her voice was raw. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Because Ethan struggled for words for a truth he barely understood himself. "Because I'm tired of watching people suffer, tired of being unable to stop it, and maybe because you remind me that there are still things worth protecting in this world, even when the world itself seems determined to destroy them." They stood there in the kitchen supplies, scattered around them, the afternoon light slanting through the windows, and something passed between them that went deeper than words. An acknowledgement, a recognition. Two broken people looking at each other and seeing not just scars, but the strength it took to survive bearing them. That night, Ethan cleaned his rifles and made sure his ammunition was dry and accessible. He checked the locks on the doors, the sturdiness of the shutters, mapping, in his mind, how he'd defend the house if it came to that. He'd done this before during the war, turning field hospitals into fortresses, calculating firing angles and escape routes while trying to save lives in the middle of battles. He heard Aiyana moving around in her room and knocked softly on her door. "I'm going to sit watch tonight, just as a precaution." The door opened. Aiyana stood there, and she'd changed into pants and a shirt she must have altered from his own clothes. Her hair was braided back from her face, and in her hand she held a knife, one of the good ones from his kitchen, the blade honed to a razor edge. "Then I'll watch with you," she said. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." She moved past him into the main room, taking a position by the window that offered a view of the approach road. "If they come, they'll come for me. That makes this my fight." Ethan wanted to argue, but knew it would be pointless. Instead, he took up a position by the other window, his rifle across his knees, and they settled in for a long night of waiting. The hours crawled past. Midnight came and went. Ethan found himself talking partly to stay awake and partly because the silence felt too heavy to bear. "I was 23 when the war started," he said quietly. "Just finished my medical training. Emily and I had been married less than a year. We had plans, open a practice, start a family, grow old together in a house with a garden." He smiled bitterly. Funny how plans go. Across the room, Aiyana listened without speaking. "When I came home, the house was still there. The garden was overgrown, but the roses Emily planted were still blooming. Everything looked the same, except she was gone, and I was different." He checked the road again, nothing but moonlight and shadow. "I tried to stay, tried to rebuild my practice. But every patient I saw, I remembered the men I couldn't save in the war. Every life I preserved felt like an accusation. Why them and not Emily? Why these strangers and not the woman who mattered most?" "So you ran," Aiyana said, not unkindly. "So I ran," Ethan agreed. "Came west because out here people don't ask too many questions about your past. Out here, you can disappear." But you didn't disappear. Aiyana shifted her eyes, catching the moonlight. You bought a woman at an auction. That's not the action of a man who wants to be invisible. No, Ethan admitted. It's the action of a man who couldn't stand by and do nothing, again. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I was 16 when they came to our village. It was early morning, the kind of morning where the mist still clings to the ground and everything is quiet. I was helping my mother prepare breakfast. My father and the other men were out hunting. My brother was playing with the other children. She paused, her knuckles white around the knife handle. We heard the gunshots first, then the screaming, then we smelled the smoke. Ethan listened, his chest tight. My mother pushed me and my brother into the root cellar, told us to be silent no matter what we heard, and we were so silent. Her voice had gone hollow, distant. We heard everything, the soldiers shouting, my mother begging, the sound of... She stopped, took a breath. When it was quiet again, we waited. We waited so long. When we finally came out, the village was ash. My mother was dead. Everyone was dead or dying or taken. I'm sorry, Ethan said, knowing how inadequate the words were. I tried to save the ones who were still alive. Used what my mother taught me about healing, but there were too many wounds, too much blood. They died while I worked on them, died while I was still trying to pack their wounds and stop the bleeding. She looked at him then, and her eyes were dry, but devastated. So you see, doctor, we're not so different. We both know what it's like to fail the people we're trying to save. You didn't fail them. Didn't I? They're still dead. That's not the same thing. Isn't it? Aiyana turned back to the window. You failed to save your wife. I failed to save my family. We're both here alive while the people we loved are dust. Tell me how that's not failure. Ethan had no answer for that. Maybe because she was right. Maybe because some truths were too painful to argue against. They fell back into silence, two ghosts keeping vigil in a house that suddenly felt very small and very vulnerable. Around 3 a.m, Ethan heard it, the soft sound of a horse moving carefully, trying to be quiet. He tensed, bringing his rifle up, and saw Aiyana do the same with her knife. You hear that? He whispered. 3 horses, maybe 4, coming from the east. Her voice was utterly calm, the voice of someone who'd lived with danger so long it had become familiar. They're trying to circle around to the barn. How can you tell? Because that's what I would do. Set the barn on fire, flush us out when we try to save the animals. She was right. Of course, she was right. Ethan moved quickly to his room, grabbed his second rifle and a box of shells. When he came back, Aiyana had moved to the door, her body coiled and ready. We can't let them burn the barn, Ethan said. The horses will panic, might hurt themselves. So we go out. Aiyana tested the door handle, her movements economical and precise. You take the front. I'll go through the window on the south side. We flank them. Aiyana, you can't, what fight? She looked at him, and in the dim lamplight her face was fierce and beautiful and absolutely unafraid. I've been fighting since I was 16 years old, doctor. I know how to kill, and I know how to die. The question is, do you... Before Ethan could answer, glass shattered in one of the back rooms. Then he smelled it, smoke and kerosene. They'd thrown a torch through the window. The house was on fire. Go! Aiyana shoved him toward the door. Get to the barn. I'll handle the house. Like hell. But she was already moving, disappearing into the smoke-filled back room with her knife gleaming. Ethan had no choice. He yanked open the front door and ran for the barn. His rifle up, his eyes scanning for movement. He saw them then, 3 figures near the barn doors, one holding a torch. In the firelight he recognized Caleb Gaines's cruel face. The man grinned when he saw Ethan and raised his pistol. Evening, Doc. Come to watch your property burn. Ethan didn't answer. He dropped to one knee, brought his rifle to his shoulder, and fired. The shot went wide, but it was close enough to make the men scatter. More gunfire erupted. They were shooting back bullets, kicking up dirt around him. Behind him, he heard glass breaking, heard Aiyana's voice shouting something in Apache. Then he saw her silhouetted against the burning house, climbing onto the roof with something in her hands, a bow. She'd made a bow from God knows what, and as he watched, she knocked an arrow and let it fly. One of the Gaines brothers screamed and went down, the arrow buried in his shoulder. "You bitch!" Caleb Gaines fired toward the roof. Aiyana rolled away, disappeared over the ridgeline, and Ethan used the distraction to run for the barn. He had to free the horses before the fire spread, had to get them out before panic killed them. He burst through the barn doors and immediately started opening stalls. Ruby first, then Smoke, then the others. The horses smelled smoke and terror and needed no urging to bolt into the night. As the last one fled, Ethan heard footsteps behind him and spun rifle rising. But it wasn't an enemy. It was Aiyana, her face smudged with soot, a cut bleeding on her forehead, her eyes wild. "The house is lost. We need to—" The barn exploded into light as someone threw another torch onto the roof. Fire caught in the dry hay spread with terrifying speed. Ethan grabbed Aiyana's arm and they ran stumbling out into the yard as flames consumed everything he'd built. 3 more shots rang out and Ethan felt something hot slice across his ribs. He stumbled, nearly fell, but Aiyana caught him, her arms surprisingly strong. "I'm hit," he managed. "I know, keep moving." She half-dragged him toward the creek, toward the cover of the trees. Behind them, men shouted, but the smoke was too thick now, the fire too bright. In the chaos, they made it to the tree line. Aiyana lowered Ethan to the ground and immediately began examining his wound. Blood soaked his shirt, but when she ripped the fabric open, she exhaled in relief. "Through and through, missed the lung. You'll live." "Good to know," Ethan gasped. The pain was setting in now, sharp and hot. Aiyana pulled off her shirt, leaving only a cotton binding beneath, and wadded the fabric against his wound. "Hold this. Pressure." He did as she said, watching as she moved through the trees with the grace of a hunting cat checking for pursuit. When she returned, her expression was grim. "They're leaving, satisfied with burning us out." She knelt beside him again, her hands surprisingly gentle as she checked his wound. "But they'll be back. Men like that always come back. Then we need to be ready." Ethan tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The world spun and Aiyana pushed him back down. "Don't move, you're losing blood." She was already gathering materials, moss, from a fallen log, strips of her ruined shirt, creek water. As she worked cleaning his wound with practiced efficiency, Ethan realized he was watching her with something like awe. This was who she really was. Not the bitter captive, not the reluctant guest, but the warrior, the survivor, the healer who knew how to fight and how to mend in equal measure. "You saved my life," he said quietly, "and you're saving mine by not dying on me right now." But there was something in her voice, something softer than he'd heard before. They sat there in the darkness, the fire consuming everything Ethan owned, painting the sky orange, and neither of them spoke of what came next, because what came next was survival, pure and simple. And for the first time since they'd met, they were no longer strangers bound by transaction. They were allies, partners, maybe even something more. Dawn came cold and gray, finding them still by the creek. Ethan had drifted in and out of consciousness through the night, his body fighting shock and blood loss, while Aiyana kept pressure on his wound and whispered words in Apache that he didn't understand, but found oddly comforting. When he finally woke fully, the sun was just breaking over the mountains, casting long shadows through the pines. He tried to sit up and immediately felt Aiyana's hand on his chest, holding him down. "Slowly," she said. "The bleeding has stopped, but if you tear it open again, I can't help you out here. How bad is it?" His voice came out as a rasp. "Bad enough. The bullet went clean through, but you need stitches. Real ones with thread and a needle, not field medicine." She sat back on her heels, and Ethan could see the exhaustion in every line of her face. She'd been awake all night, keeping watch while he drifted in fever dreams. "Can you ride?" Ethan took inventory of his body. The wound in his side was a constant throb, but when he breathed deeply, nothing caught or whistled. Aiyana was right. The bullet had missed his lung. I can ride, but to where? Town. We need the sheriff, need to report what happened, and you need a real doctor. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on either of them. Ethan was a doctor, but even doctors couldn't operate on themselves. They'll be watching the road to Silver Butte. Then we don't take the road. Aiyana stood, offering him her hand. There's a trail that runs along the high ridge. My people used it for centuries before yours came. It'll take longer, but they won't expect it. Ethan grasped her hand and let her pull him up. The world tilted sickeningly, but he locked his knees and breathed through it. When his vision cleared, he found himself standing very close to Aiyana, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to smell the smoke and sweat and something else underneath, sage and earth and survival. Thank you, he said, for staying, for fighting, for... He gestured vaguely at his bandaged side. For this. You fought too, Aiyana said quietly. You could have handed me over, bought yourself peace, but you didn't. Something flickered across her face, an emotion too quick to name. Why? Because peace bought with someone else's suffering isn't peace, it's cowardice. Ethan met her eyes, willing her to understand. And I've been a coward enough in my life. I'm done with it. They stood there for a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them before Aiyana stepped back and began gathering what little they had, his rifle, her knife, the ruined medical supplies she'd salvaged from the burning house. In the growing light, Ethan could see the full extent of the devastation. The house was a smoking ruin, the barn collapsed into itself, everything he'd owned reduced to ash and blackened timber, 10 years of his life gone in one night. I'm sorry, Aiyana said, following his gaze. About your home, about your wife's things. Things can be rebuilt. Ethan turned away from the ruins. People can't. Let's go before they come back. The horses had scattered during the fire, but Aiyana found 3 of them grazing in a meadow about a mile north. Ruby Smoke and a sturdy bay mare named Juniper. She whistled a sound like a hawk's cry, and the horses' ears pricked forward. Within minutes, she had them calm and ready, fashioning makeshift bridles from strips of leather she'd salvaged. Mounting was agony. Ethan had to bite back a groan as he swung onto Ruby's back, his wound pulling and burning. Aiyana was beside him in an instant, steadying him, her hand warm against his leg. If you fall, I'm leaving you, she said, but her voice was gentle, almost teasing. Liar. The ghost of a smile touched her lips. Maybe. They rode north, following a trail so faint Ethan wouldn't have known it was there if Aiyana hadn't been leading. She moved through the forest like she was part of it, reading signs in broken branches and disturbed earth that told stories he couldn't begin to decipher. Twice she stopped them, holding up a hand for silence, her head cocked as she listened to sounds he couldn't hear. Both times they waited until she nodded and they moved on, though Ethan never knew what danger they'd avoided. By midday, the pain in his side had become a constant fire, and Ethan knew he was fading. His vision kept blurring at the edges, and he found himself listing to one side before catching himself. Aiyana noticed, of course. She noticed everything. We need to stop, she said, guiding them off the trail toward a small clearing with a spring bubbling from the rocks. You need water and rest. We need to keep moving. You need to not die. She dismounted and came to his side, reaching up to help him down. 10 minutes, that's all. Ethan knew arguing was pointless. He let her guide him to the ground near the spring, where she immediately began checking his bandages. Blood had seeped through, not much, but enough to worry her. She stripped away the soiled cloth and cleaned the wound again with spring water so cold it made him gasp. You need to talk to me, Aiyana said as she worked her fingers swift and sure. Stay awake. Tell me about your wife. Why? Because people who are dying don't like to talk about the past. So if you talk, I know you're planning to live. She glanced up at him, and there was something fierce in her expression. Talk. So Ethan talked. He told her about Emily, about how they'd met at a church social. when he was 19 and she was 17, about how she'd laughed at his terrible dancing and then taught him the proper steps. He told her about their tiny apartment in Philadelphia, about Emily's garden where she grew roses that smelled like honey and sunshine, about the way she'd hum while she cooked, and how her hands were always stained with ink from the letters she wrote to her family. "She sounds kind," Aiyana said softly, rebandaging his wound with strips torn from her own clothing. She was too kind for the world we lived in. Ethan closed his eyes, remembering. She used to hide runaway slaves in our basement, fed them, gave them clothes, sent them north on the Underground Railroad. I was terrified someone would find out that we'd be arrested or worse. But Emily said if being good meant breaking bad laws, then that's what we'd do. She was brave, braver than me. Ethan opened his eyes, found Aiyana watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "I enlisted because I thought I could save people, thought I could stop the killing, but all I did was watch boys die screaming for their mothers while I tried to put their insides back where they belonged. And while I was doing that, Emily was dying alone. I never even got to say goodbye." Aiyana sat back, her task finished. "My mother used to say that the worst wounds are the ones we give ourselves. The ones that come from the words we didn't say, the choices we regret, the people we failed to save." She looked at the spring, watching water bubble up from stone. "You carry your wife's death like a stone around your neck, but she wouldn't want that. No one who loved you would want that." "How do you know?" "Because I carry the same stone. Because I know what it feels like to survive when everyone else died. Because—" She stopped, struggled with words. "Because I see you, Doctor. I see the way you punish yourself with every breath. And I understand it, but understanding it doesn't make it right." Before Ethan could respond, Aiyana stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the clearing, her back rigid. He wanted to go to her, wanted to say something that might ease whatever pain he'd stirred up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. So he just watched as she stood there silhouetted against the afternoon sun, a woman shaped by violence into something both terrible and beautiful. When she returned, her face was composed again, the mask back in place. "We should move. Another hour and we'll reach the ridge trail. From there, it's 3 hours to Silver Butte." "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said, as she helped him stand. "You can ask. I may not answer. Why are you helping me, really helping me, not just because you need me to get to safety?" He steadied himself against Ruby, breathing through the pain. "You hate what I represent. You have every reason to let me bleed out and take the horses yourself. So why?" Aiyana was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then quietly she said, "Because you're the first person since my family died who's treated me like a human being instead of an animal or a prize. Because you could have used your purchase for what those men intended, but you didn't. Because you were willing to die to protect me and I—" She paused, something vulnerable flickering across her face. "I'm tired of everyone I care about dying." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Ethan wanted to say something profound, something that would match the courage it took for her to speak those words. But all he could manage was, "I'm not planning on dying today." "Good." Aiyana mounted smoke in one fluid motion. "Because I'm not planning on letting you." They rode in silence after that, following the ridge trail as it climbed higher into the mountains. The view was breathtaking, endless peaks marching away to the horizon, valleys filled with mist eagles circling on thermal currents far below. This was the land Aiyana's people had called home for generations before treaties were broken and soldiers came with torches and guns. "It's beautiful," Ethan said, at one point, his voice dreamy from blood loss and exhaustion. "It was," Aiyana replied, "before it was stolen." As the sun began its descent, they finally saw Silver Butte in the distance, its buildings looking small and insignificant against the vast landscape. But before they could start the descent, Aiyana held up her hand again, bringing them to a halt. "Someone's coming," she said, her voice tight. Ethan's hand went to his rifle, though he wasn't sure he had the strength to use it. A moment later he heard it too, hoofbeats coming fast from the direction of town. Multiple riders. "Off the trail!" Aiyana hissed, guiding them into a stand of pine trees. They dismounted Ethan, moving with agonizing slowness, and waited as the riders approached. There were 5 of them, and even from a distance Ethan recognized the lead rider's profile, Sheriff Bridger. Relief flooded through him, but Aiyana's hand on his arm stopped him from calling out. "Wait," she whispered. "Look at the others." Ethan looked. 4 men rode with Bridger, and he recognized 2 of them, Josiah Gaines and Cal Henshaw. His blood turned cold. "They're riding together." "The law and the criminals," Aiyana said bitterly. "Your people's justice." They watched as the group passed below them on the main trail, heading toward what was left of Ethan's ranch. He heard Bridger's voice drift up, saying something about evidence and making it look like an accident, and the last of his faith in the law crumbled to dust. "He's with them," Ethan said numbly. "Bridger is with them." "Did you expect different?" Aiyana's voice was hard. "This is what your justice looks like for people like me. Laws that protect some and destroy others. Sheriffs who serve whoever pays best." She was right, and the truth of it was a knife in his gut, worse than the bullet wound. He'd served with Bridger, had saved his life, and all along the man had been no better than the raiders he was supposed to stop. "So what do we do?" Ethan asked. "We can't go to town. They'll be watching for us." Aiyana was quiet, thinking. Then she said, "There's a trading post, 2 days' ride east at the edge of Apache territory. A man named Walker runs it. He was married to one of my mother's cousins. He trades fairly with my people, doesn't ask questions." She looked at Ethan, measuring. "If we can get there, we'll be safe. For a while, anyway." 2 days. Ethan looked down at his bandaged side. "I don't know if I can make it." "You will." Aiyana's voice was steel. "Because the alternative is dying, and I already told you I'm done watching people I care about die." The words registered slowly, their meaning sinking in like warmth into cold flesh. "People I care about." She'd said it again, and this time it felt less like an admission and more like a promise. "All right," Ethan said. "East it is." They rode through the evening and into the night, putting distance between themselves and the town that had betrayed them. Ethan drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes not sure if he was awake or dreaming. He dreamed of Emily standing in her garden, but when she turned around, she had Aiyana's face. He dreamed of fire consuming the world while he stood paralyzed, unable to save anyone. He dreamed of drowning in darkness, and every time he surfaced, Aiyana was there, her voice pulling him back. "Stay with me, doctor, just a little farther. Don't leave me alone out here. Open your eyes. Let me see you're still fighting." And he fought, not because he particularly wanted to live, but because the thought of leaving her alone in this hostile world was unbearable. They made camp in a cave just after midnight, Aiyana choosing a spot that was defensible and hidden. She built a small fire at the back where the smoke would dissipate against stone, then set about heating water and preparing herbs she'd gathered along the trail. "I need to clean your wound properly," she said. "It's going to hurt. Everything hurts already. This will hurt more." She knelt beside him, her face illuminated by firelight. "But if I don't do it, infection will set in, and then you'll die slowly and painfully instead of quickly and relatively painlessly. You have a real gift for bedside manner." That surprised a laugh out of her, brief and startled, and Ethan realized it was the first time he'd heard her genuinely laugh. The sound was like water in the desert. "My mother would have liked you," Aiyana said, her smile fading. "She always said the best healers were the ones who could make their patients smile even in pain." Was she a healer? She was everything: healer, warrior, mother, teacher. Aiyana began cleaning his wound, and Ethan bit back a groan. She could track a deer for 3 days without losing the trail. She could deliver a baby and comfort a dying elder, She could fight with a knife or a rifle or just her hands, and she could make my father laugh, which was no small thing. "Tell me about him," Ethan said, partly to distract himself from the pain, and partly because he wanted to know, wanted to understand the people who had raised this extraordinary woman. Aiyana was quiet as she worked her movements methodical and sure. Finally, she said, "Koche means the strong one in our language. He earned that name in battle when he was 16, fighting off raiders who came for our horses. He killed 3 men that day, despite being wounded himself." She paused, threading a needle she'd pulled from a small kit. "This will hurt." She was right. The first stitch felt like fire, but Ethan breathed through it, focusing on her voice as she continued talking. "My father believed that strength wasn't just about fighting. He said true strength was knowing when to fight and when to find another way. He tried for peace, tried to negotiate with your government, tried to find a way for our people to keep even a small piece of our homeland." Her hands were steady as she stitched each movement precise. "But your people don't negotiate with those they consider less than human. They make promises they never intend to keep, treaties they break before the ink is dry. And when my father finally understood that when he realized his children would either fight or die as slaves, he chose to fight." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, knowing the words were inadequate. "So am I." Aiyana tied off the last stitch and sat back examining her work. "There, that should hold if you don't do anything stupid." "Define stupid." "Riding for 2 days with a bullet wound, for instance." She met his eyes, and there was something in her gaze that made his breath catch. "But since that's exactly what we're doing, I suppose we're both stupid." "Maybe." Ethan reached up without thinking and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was intimate, too familiar, and he realized what he'd done only after his hand had already fallen away. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "Why did you do that?" Aiyana's voice was quiet, not angry, but genuinely curious. "I don't know, instinct maybe." Ethan felt heat in his face that had nothing to do with fever. "Emily used to have this same piece of hair that would never stay back, and I'd—" He trailed off, realizing how that sounded, but Aiyana didn't look offended. Instead, she reached up and touched her own hair, where his fingers had been her expression, thoughtful. "You're not trying to make me into her." "No, you're nothing like her." At Aiyana's raised eyebrow, he quickly added, "That's not an insult. Emily was gentle, domestic, everything the world told her a woman should be. You're—" He struggled for words. "You're like lightning, dangerous and beautiful and impossible to contain. Lightning kills people. So does standing still when the storm comes." Ethan held her gaze. "I'd rather be struck by lightning than die of safety." Something shifted in the air between them, electric and charged. Aiyana leaned closer, close enough that he could see the individual lashes framing her eyes, close enough that their breath mingled in the cool cave air. "You're delirious from blood loss," she said, but she didn't pull away. "Probably, and in no condition for this." "For what?" Instead of answering, Aiyana closed the distance between them and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, but it sent lightning through Ethan's veins that had nothing to do with fever. When she pulled back, her eyes were wide, as if she'd surprised herself as much as him. "That was—" Ethan started. "A mistake." Aiyana finished, standing abruptly. "You need rest, we both do. Sleep, I'll keep watch." "Aiyana, sleep, doctor." Her voice was firm, brooking no argument, but Ethan could see the tremble in her hands as she turned away to tend the fire. He wanted to argue, wanted to pull her back and tell her it wasn't a mistake, that it was the first thing that had felt right in longer than he could remember. But exhaustion pulled at him like a tide, and his body's need for rest overrode everything else. As he drifted into sleep, his last conscious thought was of Aiyana's lips on his, and the way the world had tilted on its axis in that single stolen moment. He didn't see her turn back to look at him once he was asleep, didn't see the way she touched her own lips. With trembling fingers, didn't see the conflict warring in her eyes. She sat there through the night, feeding the fire and watching over him, while outside the cave wind sang through the pines and carried with it the scent of approaching rain. When morning came, they would ride for Walker's trading post. They would fight to survive, to find safety in a world determined to destroy them both. But for now, in the small hours of night, with only fire and shadow for company, Aiyana let herself imagine what might be possible if they survived. Let herself hope just for a moment that lightning and the man willing to be struck by it might find a way to become something more than just two broken people trying not to break each other. The fire crackled. The darkness pressed close, and in sleep Ethan smiled, dreaming of something other than death and ash for the first time in a decade. Morning arrived with rain, the kind that comes soft at first and then builds to a steady drumming that washes the world clean. Ethan woke to the sound of it and to the smell of something cooking over the fire. His side ached with a deep bone-level throb, but when he moved experimentally, the pain was bearable. The stitches held. Aiyana sat by the fire, her back straight, her profile sharp against the cave's darkness. She'd changed somehow in the night, or maybe he was just seeing her differently now. She looked both younger and older at once, vulnerable in the firelight, but carved from stone in her stillness. "You're awake," she said without turning. "Good, we need to leave soon." There was no mention of the kiss, no acknowledgement of what had passed between them. Ethan understood survival first, everything else later, if there was a later. "What's for breakfast?" he asked, pushing himself up carefully. "Rabbit, I caught it before dawn." She turned to look at him, then her eyes scanning his face with a healer's assessment. "How do you feel?" "Like I was shot and then rode through the night." He tried for a smile. "But alive, thanks to you." "Don't thank me yet. We still have 2 days ahead of us, and they'll be looking for us." She handed him a portion of the roasted meat on a flat stone. "Eat quickly. We leave as soon as the rain lets up enough to see the trail." They ate in silence, but it was different from the hostile silence of their first days. This was companionable, the quiet of two people who'd learned to exist in each other's space without friction. When they were done, Aiyana checked his bandages again, her fingers gentle but impersonal, as if she were tending to any patient, rather than the man she'd kissed the night before. "It looks good," she said finally. "No signs of infection yet, but you'll need to take it easy today." "I'll do my best." Your best is usually stupid and stubborn. But there was almost affection in her voice. They packed what little they had and saddled the horses just as the rain began to ease. The world outside the cave was washed clean, every pine needle sharp and glistening, the air so clear it hurt to breathe. They rode east, following game trails that wound through forests, so old they felt like cathedrals past meadows, where elk grazed in the morning mist across streams, running high with runoff. Ethan found himself watching Aiyana as they rode, the way she moved with the horse as if they were one creature, the way her eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, missing nothing. She was in her element out here, away from the towns and settlements that had brought her nothing but pain. This was her land, had been her people's land for longer than his people had even known it existed. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and refill their water. Aiyana disappeared into the trees for a few minutes and returned with a handful of berries and some kind of root vegetable. "Lunch," she said, dividing them. "Not much, but it'll keep us going." As they ate, Ethan finally gathered the courage to address what neither of them had mentioned. "About last night, we don't need to talk about it," Aiyana interrupted, her voice flat. "I think we do." "Why?" She turned to face him fully, her expression guarded. "It was a moment of weakness. You were injured, I was tired, and we both did something foolish. That's all." "Is that really what you think it was?" Aiyana's jaw tightened. "What else could it be, Doctor? You bought me. That transaction, no matter your intentions, will always be between us. How can there be anything real when the foundation is that broken?" The words hit him like a physical blow, all the more painful because they were true. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can't undo what I did, can't erase the way we met or the circumstances that brought you to my door, but I can tell you that what I feel—" He stopped, struggled for words. "It's not ownership, it's not obligation, it's something else, something I don't have a name for yet." "Then don't name it." Aiyana stood abruptly, turning away. "Naming things gives them power, and I can't afford to give anything more power over me than it already has. I'm barely surviving as it is." "You're not just surviving," Ethan said, standing despite the protest from his wound. "You're living, fighting, refusing to let them break you. That's not survival, that's resistance. That's strength." "Strength?" She laughed, bitter and broken. "I'm running, hiding, depending on the mercy of a man who—" She stopped herself. "Who? What?" "Nothing. We should go." But Ethan reached out and caught her wrist gently, carefully, ready to release her if she pulled away. She didn't. "Aiyana, look at me." Slowly she turned. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and the sight of them cracked something in Ethan's chest. He'd seen her angry, seen her fierce, seen her deadly, but he'd never seen her cry. "I was wrong," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That first day I said you bought your shame, but that's not what you bought. You bought me a chance to breathe, to think, to be something other than property or prey for the first time in months." A tear escaped, traced down her cheek, and that terrifies me because chances can be taken away. Safety can be destroyed, and I don't think I can survive losing one more thing I've let myself care about. Ethan's thumb moved across her wrist over the scars and rope burns, the physical evidence of everything she'd endured. "Then we won't lose it," he said. "We'll fight for it, together." "You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise I'll try, that I'll stand beside you, not in front of you or behind you, but beside you as an equal, as a partner." He released her wrist, but his hand lingered near hers. "Not because I bought you, but because you chose to stay, because somewhere in the ashes of my ranch and the ruins of our pasts, we found something worth protecting." Aiyana stared at him for a long moment, and Ethan could see the war raging behind her eyes, the desire to believe warring with the terror of hoping. Finally, she reached up and touched his face, her palm rough and warm against his cheek. "If we do this," she said slowly, "if we try to be whatever it is we're becoming, there are things you need to understand. My people have different ways, different ceremonies. If I give myself to you, it won't be the way your people do it, with papers and preachers and promises that mean nothing when convenience demands otherwise. Then teach me your ways. It won't be easy. It will require blood and pain and a commitment that goes deeper than words. I'm not afraid of pain, and I've learned that easy things rarely matter." Ethan covered her hand with his own. "Teach me." Something in Aiyana's expression shifted, softened, as if a wall she'd been holding up had finally crumbled. "My mother's people believe that marriage is about shared scars, not shared comfort. That two people becoming one means carrying each other's wounds as your own." She pulled back her sleeve, revealing a thin scar on her inner forearm. "When my parents married, they cut matching marks and let their blood mix, not as ownership, but as recognition that their pain was shared, their strength was shared, their lives were shared until death." Ethan understood what she was asking, what she was offering. It was terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. "And you want to, not here, not now." Aiyana pulled her sleeve back down. "If we survive the next 2 days, if we reach Walker's Post and find safety, if you still want this after you've had time to think clearly without fever and blood loss clouding your judgment, then we'll talk about scars." "I'll still want it," Ethan said with certainty. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." He stepped closer, wincing slightly at the pull in his side. "Because for the first time since Emily died, I feel alive. Not just breathing, not just existing, but truly alive. And that's because of you. Because you refuse to let the world's cruelty make you cruel. because you fight like lightning and heal like rain, because you're the strongest person I've ever met, and somehow you're choosing to be here with me when you could have disappeared into these mountains and been free. Freedom is overrated when you're alone, Aiyana said softly. They stood there in the dappled sunlight, two scarred souls finding their way toward each other, until finally Aiyana stepped back. We really do need to go. Walker's Post is still a day and a half away, and I'd like to get there before they catch up to us. The afternoon wore on as they rode deeper into Apache territory. The landscape changed subtly. The trees grew different, the rock formations took on new shapes, and Ethan began to see signs of human presence. Not the heavy-handed marks of white settlement, but the lighter touch of people who'd lived in harmony with the land for generations. A circle of stones that had once been a fire pit, faint paths worn into hillsides, a stack of rocks that Aiyana explained was a trail marker. My people have been here for longer than anyone can count, she said as they paused at one such marker. We know every spring, every cave, every pass through the mountains. This land remembers us even if your people try to forget we were ever here. I won't forget, Ethan promised. They made camp that evening in a grove of aspens, the trees' white bark glowing in the fading light. Ethan's wound had held up better than he'd expected, though he was exhausted down to his bones. Aiyana built another small fire and prepared a tea from the willow bark she'd gathered, insisting he drink it for the pain. You're going to make me into an Apache yet, Ethan joked as he sipped the bitter brew. Impossible, you're too pale and too stubborn. But she smiled as she said it, and the sight of that smile made Ethan's heart ache in a way that had nothing to do with his injury. After they ate, Aiyana did something unexpected. She began to sing her voice low and haunting words, in a language Ethan didn't understand but felt in his chest nonetheless. It was a lullaby, he realized, or something like it, a song of comfort and protection, the kind a mother might sing to a frightened child. When she finished, Ethan asked, "What was that? Something my mother used to sing when the storms came. It's about the earth holding us safe, about how we're never alone because the mountains remember all who walk upon them." Aiyana stared into the fire. She sang it the night before the soldiers came. I think somehow she knew it was the last time. I wish I could have met her. She would have liked you, probably would have scolded you for being too thin and tried to fatten you up. Aiyana's smile was sad. She had a gift for seeing the good in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. You have that gift too. No, I just have good aim and a stubborn refusal to die. But her tone was lighter than her words. They sat in comfortable silence until the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. This time, when they bedded down for the night, Aiyana didn't retreat to the far side of the camp. She settled close to Ethan, close enough that he could feel her warmth, hear her breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep. He lay awake a while longer, staring up at the stars and thinking about scars and ceremonies, about the strange path that had led him from a burning auction block to this grove of aspens with a woman who'd become far more than he'd ever intended or imagined. Life, he realized, had a way of breaking all your plans and replacing them with something you never knew you needed. The next day dawned clear and bright, and they rode hard, covering ground quickly. Aiyana seemed more relaxed now that they were deep in territory she knew, and she pointed out landmarks as they passed the cliff, where her brother had caught his first eagle, the meadow, where her father had taught her to track deer, the spring where her mother had been married beneath a full moon. You're taking me through your history, Ethan realized. I'm showing you who I am, Aiyana corrected, where I come from, what I've lost, and what I'm trying to hold on to. If we're going to do this, whatever this is, you need to understand that you're not just getting me. You're getting all of this. She gestured at the landscape around them, the land, the ghosts, the memories, all of it. I understand, Ethan said, and I want all of it. Late in the afternoon, they crested a ridge and saw at Walker's trading post, a cluster of buildings in a valley where two streams met. Smoke rose from the chimneys, and Ethan could see figures moving between the structures. As they descended, several people emerged to watch their approach, and Ethan heard Aiyana release a breath she'd been holding. An older man with gray-streaked hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors stepped forward. His eyes widened when he saw Aiyana. "Little bird," he said in accented English, using what must have been her childhood name. "Is that truly you?" "Hello, Uncle Walker," Aiyana replied, and then she was off her horse and being enfolded in the man's embrace. She spoke rapidly in Apache, and Walker responded in kind, his face cycling through shock, grief, and finally, a fierce protectiveness. When they switched back to English, Walker turned to Ethan, his expression assessing. "And who is this white man you bring to my door?" "This is Dr. Ethan Calloway," Aiyana said, and something in her voice made Walker's eyebrows rise. "He helped me, saved me, actually, several times now." Walker studied Ethan for a long moment, taking in the blood-stained bandages, the exhaustion, the way Ethan stood, despite obviously being in pain. "A doctor who fights. Interesting." He glanced at Aiyana. "And you trust him?" "I do," Aiyana said, without hesitation. That seemed to be enough for Walker. "Then you're both welcome. Come, let's get you inside. You look half dead, Doctor, and little bird looks like she's been holding the world together by force of will, alone." The trading post was more than just a store. It was a refuge, a meeting place, a neutral ground where Apache and whites and Mexicans all came to trade without the usual violence. Walker's wife, a quiet Apache woman named Nalnish, took one look at Ethan's wound and immediately began gathering supplies while scolding Aiyana in a mix of languages for not bringing him sooner. Over the next few hours, Ethan's wound was properly cleaned and dressed. He was fed until he couldn't eat anymore, and he was given a real bed for the first time in days. But even as his body began to relax, his mind stayed alert, listening to the conversations happening in other rooms, in other languages, trying to piece together what came next. That evening, Walker found him on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The older man settled into a chair beside him, producing a pipe and tobacco. "Little bird told me what happened," Walker said after a moment. "The auction, the ranch, the fire, the betrayal." He puffed his pipe. "You made powerful enemies, Doctor." "I made the only choice I could live with," Ethan replied. "Honorable. Stupid, but honorable." Walker smiled slightly. "The Gaines brothers won't stop. Men like that never do. They'll keep coming until they get what they want or until they're dead." "I know. So what are you going to do?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to build something they can't burn down, a place where people like Aiyana can find safety, where the law actually protects instead of oppressing, where the color of your skin doesn't determine your worth." Walker laughed sharp and short. "You're describing a dream, Doctor. Dreams don't survive in the territories." "Maybe not, but I have to try." Ethan turned to look at Walker directly. "I've spent 10 years running from the world, hiding from my failures. But Aiyana, she's taught me that hiding isn't the same as healing, that sometimes you have to stand and fight for what matters, even when the odds are impossible." "You love her," Walker said. It wasn't a question. "I'm beginning to, yes." "Does she know?" "I think so. We haven't—" Ethan struggled for words. "It's complicated. Love usually is." Walker stood stretching. "For what it's worth, she looks at you differently than she looks at other whites, like you're a person instead of an enemy. That's rare for someone who's suffered what she has. Don't waste it." "I won't." That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Aiyana found Ethan still on the porch. She sat beside him, and for a while they just existed in the darkness, listening to night sounds and breathing the same air. "Walker told me what you said," Aiyana finally spoke, "about building something that can't be burned. It's probably foolish." "Probably," she agreed, "but maybe the world needs more fools willing to try impossible things." She turned to face him. If you're serious about this, about us, about building something lasting, then we need to do it right. The Apache way. Ethan's heart began to race. You mean, I want to share scars with you. To bind myself to you in a way that your people and mine both understand. To become partners in the truest sense. Her hand found his in the darkness. But I need to know you understand what that means. It's not just a ceremony, it's a promise that when I bleed, you bleed. When I hurt, you hurt. When I fight, you fight beside me always. I understand, Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion, and I want it, all of it. You, the scars, the fight. I want to build a life with you that honors who you are and where you come from. Aiyana pulled out a small knife from her belt, the blade catching moonlight. Then we do this now, before we lose our courage or our luck runs out. Before the world finds a way to separate us again. Ethan rolled up his sleeve without hesitation, baring his forearm. Aiyana did the same, and in the moonlight he could see the faint scar from her parents' ceremony. With steady hands she drew the blade across her skin, not deep but enough to well blood. Then she handed the knife to Ethan. Make yours match mine, she instructed. Same length, same place. This mark will remind us every day that we chose each other, that we are bound by something stronger than papers or property or any law made by men who understand neither of us. Ethan took the knife and with a surgeon's precision cut a matching line on his own arm. The pain was sharp but clean, and as blood welled up, Aiyana pressed their wounds together, their blood mingling. By the earth that holds us, she said in Apache, then translated, by the sky that watches over us. By the blood we share, I claim you as my equal, my partner, my husband in all the ways that matter. I will carry your wounds as my own. I will stand beside you in every storm. I will build with you, fight without you, live with you, until death parts us. This I swear on the memory of my mother, on the strength of my father, on every ancestor who came before. Ethan felt tears prick his eyes as he responded, I swear the same, to honor you, protect you, stand beside you as an equal, to carry your pain as mine and share your strength, to build a life with you that respects who you are and who you were and who you'll become. Until death and beyond, I am yours as you are mine. They held their arms pressed together for a long moment, feeling each other's pulse, each other's pain, each other's strength. When they finally pulled apart, Aiyana tore a strip from her shirt and bound both their wounds together, wrapping the cloth around and around until their arms were fastened side by side. Now we wait, she said softly, until the blood stops and the binding can be removed. In this time, we meditate on what we've promised, on what we're becoming. They sat there through the night, arms bound, sitting so close that Ethan could feel Aiyana's heartbeat, where their sides touched. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Aiyana carefully unwound the cloth. The wounds had closed, leaving matching scars that would fade but never fully disappear. It's done, she said, but Ethan heard the emotion beneath the simple words. We're bound, married in the way of my people. And I've never felt more honored, Ethan replied, pulling her close. This time when they kissed, it wasn't stolen or uncertain. It was a promise kept, a future claimed, two damaged souls choosing to heal together rather than bleed alone. Over the following weeks, word spread through both white and Apache communities about the doctor who'd defied the slave traders and married an Apache woman. Some called it scandal, others called it treason, but slowly, carefully, people began to arrive at Walker's trading post, seeking them out. A runaway slave with a baby desperate for medical care, a half-blood child abandoned by both parents, an old Apache woman with nowhere else to go. Each one Ethan and Aiyana took in, offering healing, protection, and hope. 6 months later, they left Walker's post to rebuild Ethan's ranch, but this time with help from Apache workers and white sympathizers alike. They constructed not just a house, but a sanctuary strong enough to defend, open enough to welcome a place that existed outside the cruel hierarchies of the territory. They called it Two Fires, after Aiyana's vision, and it became a refuge for anyone caught between worlds. The Gaines brothers came again, of course. But this time Ethan and Aiyana were ready. With Sheriff Bridger exposed and replaced with allies who believed in what they were building, the raiders found themselves outmatched. The fight was brief and brutal, and when it was over, the threat that had haunted them was finally ended. Years passed. Two Fires grew from a ranch into a community, a place where children of all colors learned together, where medicine was practiced freely, where old hatreds began to fade in the face of shared purpose. Ethan taught medicine to anyone willing to learn, sharing his knowledge, alongside Aiyana's traditional healing. She taught Apache ways to those who'd lost their connection to their heritage, keeping alive the languages and stories and skills that would have otherwise died. On their 10th anniversary, as they stood on the porch of their rebuilt home watching sunset paint the mountains gold, Aiyana rested her hand over her swollen belly, their second child growing strong. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Buying me that day, setting all this in motion." Ethan looked at the scars on their arms, faded now, but still visible, still binding them together. He thought about everything they'd lost and everything they'd built, about the impossibility of their love, surviving in a world determined to destroy it, about the community thriving around them because two broken people had refused to stay broken. Regret. He pulled her close, one hand protectively over their unborn child. "No, I regret a lot of things in my life. The war, losing Emily, the years I wasted hiding, but buying your freedom so we could find each other. That's the only thing I've ever done that I know without doubt was absolutely right." Aiyana smiled, that rare, genuine smile that still made his heart skip. "You didn't buy my freedom, Doctor. You bought us a chance. We earned the freedom ourselves." And as the sun sank below the mountains and their first child called them in for dinner, Ethan realized she was right. Freedom couldn't be purchased or given. It could only be fought for, built together, and protected with everything you had. Just like love, just like family, just like the scars they bore and the home they'd created from ashes and hope and a stubborn refusal to let the world's cruelty have the final word.